This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was always curious. This morning, George was curious the moment he woke up, because he knew it was a special day. At breakfast, George's friend said, "Today, we are going to celebrate, because just 3 years ago this day, I brought you home with me from the jungle. So tonight, I'll take you to the animal show. But first, I have a surprise for you." He took George out to the yard where a big box was standing. George was very curious. Out of the box came a bicycle. George was delighted. That's what he had always wanted. He knew how to ride a bicycle, but he had never had one of his own. "I must go now," said the man, "but I'll be back in time for the animal show. Be careful with your new bike and keep close to the house while I'm gone." George could ride very well and even do all sorts of tricks. He could ride with both hands off the handlebar. And he could ride like a cowboy on a wild bronco. And he could also ride backwards. But after a while, George got tired of doing tricks and went out into the street. The newsboy was just passing by with his bag full of papers. "That's a fine bike you got there," he said to George. "How would you like to help me deliver the papers?" He handed George the bag and told him to do one side of the street first and then turn back and do the other side. George was very proud as he rode off with his bag. He started to deliver the papers on one side of the street as he had been told. When he came to the last house, he saw a little river in the distance. George was curious. So, instead of turning back to deliver the rest of the papers, he just went on. There was a lot to see at the river. A duck family was paddling downstream. A man was fishing from the bridge. And 2 boys were playing with their boats. George wanted to stop and look at the boats, but he was afraid the boys might find out he hadn't delivered all the papers. So he rode on. While riding along, George kept thinking of boats all the time. It would be such fun to have a boat. But how could he get one? He thought and thought, and then he had an idea. He got off the bicycle, took a newspaper out of the bag, and began to fold it. First, he folded down the corners, like this. Then he folded both edges up, brought the ends together, and flattened it sidewise. Then he turned one corner up, then the other one, again brought the ends together, and flattened it sidewise. Then, gently, he pulled the ends open, and there was his boat. Now the moment had come to launch the boat. Would it float? It did. So George decided to make some more boats. Finally, he had used up all the papers and had made so many boats that he couldn't count them. A whole fleet. Watching his fleet sailing down the river, George felt like an admiral. But he forgot to watch where he was going. Suddenly, the bicycle hit a rock, and George flew off the seat head first. Luckily, George was not hurt, but the front wheel of the bicycle was all out of shape, and the tire was blown out. George tried to ride the bicycle, but of course it wouldn't go. So he started carrying it, but it soon got too heavy. George didn't know what to do. His new bike was spoiled. The newspapers were gone. He wished he had listened to his friend and kept close to the house. Now, he just stood there and cried. Suddenly, his face brightened. Why, he had forgotten. He could ride on one wheel. He had hardly started out again when rolling toward him came an enormous tractor with huge trailers behind it. Looking out of the trailers were all sorts of animals. The tractor stopped, and two men jumped out. "Well, well," said one of the men, "a little monkey who can ride a bike Bronco fashion. We can use you in our animal show tonight. I'm the director of the show, and this is Bob. He can straighten your wheel and fix that flat in no time. And then we'll take you along to the place where the show is going to be." So the three of them got into the cab and drove off. "Maybe you could play a fanfare while you ride your bike in the show," the director said. "I have a bugle for you right here. And later on, you'll get a green coat and cap, just like Bob's." On the showgrounds, everybody was busy getting things ready for the show. "I must do some work now," said the director. "Meanwhile, you may have a look around and get acquainted with all the animals. But you must not feed them, especially the ostrich, because he will eat anything and might get very sick afterwards." George was very curious. He wouldn't eat a bugle, or would he? George went a little closer to the cage, and before he knew it, the ostrich had snatched the bugle and tried to swallow it. But it got stuck in his throat. Funny sounds came out as the ostrich was struggling with the bugle, all blue in the face. George was frightened. Fortunately, the men had heard the noise. They came rushing to the cage and got the bugle out of the ostrich's throat just in time. The director was very angry with George and said, "You can't take part in the show now. We'll have to send you home." George had to sit on a bench all by himself. He was terribly sorry for what he had done, but now it was too late. Meanwhile, the ostrich had got hold of a string dangling near his cage. This string held the door to the cage of the baby bear. As the ostrich nibbled at it, the door opened, and the baby bear got out. He ran straight for a high tree near the camp. George jumped up, grabbed the bugle, and blew as loud as he could. The men heard the alarm. When they saw the empty cage and the ostrich nibbling at the string, they knew what had happened. George rushed to his bicycle and raced toward the tree. The men were worried because they didn't know how to get the little bear down safely. But George had his plan. He went up the tree as fast as only a monkey can. And when he reached the baby bear, he put him in his bag and carefully let him down so that the men could safely catch him. Hooray! Everybody cheered. And the director said, "George, you are a brave little monkey. You saved the baby bear's life. Now you'll get your coat back. And of course, you may ride your bike and play the bugle in the show." Finally, the show was on. The whole town had come to see it. And how surprised they were to discover George on his bike right in the middle of it. The newsboy was there, and also the man with the yellow hat. He'd been looking for George everywhere and was happy to have found him at last. The newsboy was glad to have his bag again, and the people from the other side of the street whose papers George had made into boats were not angry with him anymore. When the time had come for George to say goodbye, the director let him keep the coat and the cap and the bugle. And then George and his friend got into the car and went home.